This is Bringing the Darkness to the Light with Catherine Nadal, professional psychic medium.
Today's guest is DeLeon. As above, so below, Emporium Ltd. was created by Kat. It was launched in October 2023. Originally from the States, Kat has lived in New York City and Greater Boston in Massachusetts. As an adult, she lived in London, Barcelona, Prague, Oslo, and now Liverpool. The minute she arrived, she fell in love with the city, and just like in the song, she said, "And here I will stay." Since settling in, her main goal was to become a real part of Liverpool and to give something back to the city she loves. The Emporium will be just that. It's a pleasure to have you on, Kat.
Thanks, Kathy. How are you?
Oh, great. Yeah, this is very cool for me to talk to you again. You and I worked together for a few years in Salem, Massachusetts during the Halloween season. And I always was like happy to be situated next to you in the room because your energy is tremendous. So this is like my first time I can actually say that we've caught up like one-on-one. In a couple of years, but I have to say how proud I am of you, because back in the day when we were sitting together in Salem, you were saying, well, you know, I could do this, I could do that. You were like, but I know that I'm going to live overseas. Like there was nothing in your mind that was going to convince you that that was not going to happen. And I was like, go right ahead, like, you know. And I truly believe in people that follow their passion, but also follow their dream. And you're an old soul to me. I mean, you always were. I mean, when we met up the first time, I could still see your face. I was like, wow. I was like, I know her already. There's something there. I think we know each other already. So
yeah, we're both Spanish Cathys, and we both were little kids in New York City
that's
in
right.
the 60s. So yeah, we've got pretty mundane connections, but I think we've got bigger connections than that for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's very cool. You know, you have such vast experience. What I want to do is I want to step back. I mean, I know right now you're a store owner, you're living in Liverpool. I recently had connected you with Charles Rosenet, a good friend of mine, who is very big in the Beatles community, who takes tours over there and stuff. So this past year, there was just so many connections that actually were Beatles related that I was like, oh my God. Every time I turned around, I was like, Liverpool was like in my face. And I was like, that's it. I was like, I have to connect with Kat again. So it's cool. So how did you start out your life, like being a little girl? Like since I was a little girl, I knew, you know, I was having visions, I was having dreams. How did it all start with you?
Well, you know, when I was little, I lived in New York City with my parents, and I did see things and I did feel things. I think it really came on me strongly when I turned 12 after the death of my father. But yeah, I mean, from the music perspective, even that we were just talking about, like, you know, I was living in New York City when the Beatles came to America for the first time. And my father actually took me to Times Square to see Hard Day's Night. So it was really cool because it just had its big anniversary. The film just had its big anniversary, and they, you know, screened it in Liverpool here. And I went and I was just thinking about it and saying to myself, my God, like 50 years ago, probably to the day, or 60 years ago, I should say, to the day, my father took me by the hand as like a 4 or 5 year old kid and took me to Times Square to see this movie. And like, here I am living in the city that it all began. It was a really magical journey, you know.
That's amazing. You know, and, you know, going back 50, 60 years ago in New York City, it was a different place, you know,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
especially now, you know, living with the current situation, what's going on in the city. But, you know, no matter what happens in New York City, there's always an electrifying vibe, you know, and that's why I think a lot of musicians kind of like make that a mecca, you know, they travel there because there is this vibe. It's just like LA.
Yeah. Yeah. New York's a very special place. And if I had to say that I miss anything about living in the States, one of the things that I do miss is, you know, coming up to, down to New York and hanging out in the Lower East Side and hanging out in the Village and my old stomping grounds, the Continental and all that kind of thing. I miss it. I really do.
Yes, well, there's a couple of places that are still around. So if you want to come visit, you can hang out with me at the Bowery Electric and 2A and a couple other places that are still there.
Cool.
So,
But yeah, I mean, I think that as far as like the paranormal and the witchy side of things, because I was an only child living in the Bronx and pretty much isolated in a certain way, I think that I was very open. I was very open to a lot of phenomenon. Of course, when you're little, you say you see things or you hear things or you know things, and your parents just go, "Oh yeah, sure, right," go play. But it was a common thread that ran through my life, and like I say, I think it hit its apex at 12 when my father died, and shortly thereafter, I picked up my first set of tarot cards and started reading, and I haven't looked back since, really.
I understand that. I actually talked about it in my second book, but in my, I don't know, I must have been 16 when my mother suddenly passed away. And it was shortly after that that a girl I knew told me about Enchantments, which was down on East Ninth Street, and it was a witch shop. And I went down there, and I was talking with this lady, and they had a black cat in there, and it's just like this enchanting place. And the woman just randomly gave me this essential oil. The essential oil happened to be gardenia. And I put it in my purse, and I was traveling back on the train, and I was like, oh my gosh, like she really must know what's going on, because that was my mother's favorite scent.
Wow.
And my mother used to tell this story about how she had all these gardenias in her bridal bouquet, and they were so strong that she almost like fainted on the altar. And like it was like this famous story. And I was like holding this essential oil, and I was like, wow, walking away from the shop, I actually felt like I missed it. And I was like, wow, it wasn't in there that long, but I just had such a connection when I was there. And then her giving me that oil, I was like, wow. I was like, there really is something more than we know. And by her giving me that essential oil, it was probably the most support that I got from an adult at that time. And it was a stranger, because a lot of things in the 80s weren't talked about, like grief and how to deal with teens when a parent dies. We just didn't talk about it. Like, just keep going to school and that'll fix things. But this one woman giving me the essential oil just made everything that much better for me. So
I think that what was going on was that your mother told her to give you that oil so that you would know that she was always with you, and that oil is like a trigger for you, so that if you want to feel your mother with you or you want to call your mother to you, all you have to do is break out that oil.
absolutely. I totally agree. And now, many years later, working as a medium, I found many connections for other people in very similar ways. So it's interesting. So having that shop, and I'm very good friends with Lady Rhea, and Lady Rhea was one of the original candle, carving candles in the enchantments in the 80s. So, did you have a shop experience in the Village like I did? Did you go to enchantments? Did you go to Washington Square Park like I did, and all the flea markets that were like lined up?
I went to enchantments and I used to go to the Magical Child, but this is like way back, this is further on, like when I was a young adult. After I came back from London, moved back to Boston, and we'd go down to New York, a lot to see gigs or visit my cousin or something like that. And I would go to Magical Child a lot. That place fascinated me. And I
Yes.
think that I don't think that my shop, I don't think that anybody who had ever been to Magical Child would walk into my shop and say, oh my God, this reminds me of Magical Child. But I did bring some of my inspiration from that shop to make it like a very sort of old world, old school emporium, as opposed to like these, flashy sort of like new age boutiquey places. This has a very old school vibe to it.
Yeah, that's what I love about it. Lady Rhea started at Magical Child, and I think Magical Child kind of rolled into Enchantments. So I
Yeah.
think there was a big connection between the two shops. So that's amazing. You know, the 80s was such a kind of a funky time in New York City. So what did you do after that? Like after doing all that New York City stuff, where did you go from there?
Well, let's backtrack a little bit. Right after I got out of school, I moved to London and I lived in London for about a year. I wanted to do classical theater, and I ended up falling into like the post punk scene heavily. And I was going out and seeing a lot of shows, and I was hanging out with a lot of musicians. And I ended up meeting someone and getting married. And we came back to Boston thinking it was just for 6 months because my mother insisted on me having a big wedding. So I had to come back, but we ended up staying because it was like, well, you know, Reagan America versus Thatcher England. Believe it or not, Reagan America was better. So we stayed, and then my marriage broke up, and I kind of ended up getting stuck in the States, and I was doing a bunch of different things. I was writing, I was painting, I was doing some theater. I was kind of, I don't know. I was witchcraft and card reading and spiritualism was always a part of my life, but it wasn't in the front. It was just something that I did. It was part of my belief system, and I kept it close. The first time that I ventured into doing it, I'd say like really professionally, was when I got laid off from a publishing company I was working for, and I wondered what would it be like to do readings in a shop. And I was walking past the Tremont Tea Room, which was one of the oldest readings rooms in the country. I think it was established in like 1933, and it was right in the center of Old Boston. It was on Tremont Street. And back in the olden days, actually, my mother went there in the 50s, and it was a proper tea room. So you'd pay like a price fix, and you would get your tea, and they'd bring out little finger sandwiches, and you drink your tea, and these little old ladies would walk around the tables, and they'd see if you were almost done, and then they'd sit down and they'd read your tea leaves. But by the time I came along, you know, it had evolved more or less into a tarot room. That we still did tea leaf readings, but I walked in there one day and I was like, "Gee, I wonder if you're taking on readers." And the owner, his name was Alex Palermo, he said, "Oh my God, I desperately need women readers. Read for me now, and if I like you, you're hired." And so I was hired, and I worked there for a little over a year. And then I moved out of the city center closer to Salem, and I started writing for a newspaper. And gosh, you know, I mean, it was just, I was writing a lot. I was doing rock and roll journalism. I was writing for a webzine out of New York City, actually, called Propeller. And I used to do a lot of interviews with, well, of course, because I was one of the executive editors, I got to pick who I'd interview. So I picked all my heroes. So I interviewed people like Daniel Ash and Peter Murphy and Wayne Hussey and Patricia Morrison and even Peter Tork from the Monkees, which, believe it or not, was one of the most magical conversations with someone I've ever had. The guy he played the dummy, but he was one of the most intelligent people I ever know. I consider him a teacher because he really structured his life on the Joseph Campbell premise of the hero's journey. And the bulk of that interview was really a discussion of that, about like his transformation and transcendence from like this sort of pop, you know, kid in the pop world who didn't really know what he was doing and in the steeps of addiction, to understanding the spiritual journey of his life as he became sober, looking back at the things that had happened to him, and you know, truly following his passions as he got to be older and understanding the purpose of life's journeys. He really was amazing. And when he died, I was devastated. It really hit me hard because I realized that in the few hours I talked to him on the phone, and the one time or two times that I actually met him in person, how much of impression he made upon me and how much I learned from him. It was really amazing. So even though I was doing other things, spirituality, philosophy, metaphysics, esotericism, all this stuff is always been very important to me. And it's always been interwoven in, my painting or anything that I've written, the kind of courses that I was teaching at college. When I would teach introduction to literature, I would lean heavily on mythology and the Greek tragedies, and even modern things like Jack Kerouac, for example, is heavily spiritual and, lots of esoteric messages in there. So I was in Massachusetts reading at the Tremont Tea Room. I started doing journalism, and then I started teaching at a community college. And then right before I met you, I got hit by an SUV and I almost died. I was crossing the road. I had the light. I was in the crosswalk. I was on my way to get some coffee before my lecture. And I looked up and I saw this big white Lincoln Navigator coming at me. And I was like, why? What the hell? Who? What? Oh no, I'm going to die. And it was the day before my birthday. It was the day before my 56th birthday. And my father died at 56 years old. So I was seeing all the significance in that, and I did indeed almost die. They said it was a miracle that I didn't get hit in the head. I didn't get back damage. I did break almost everything on my left-hand side, and I was not walking for a good 2 months. And then it was a very slow process to recovery. But what I recently realized was that event was in my second Saturn return, and it gave me a new life, or the opportunity to begin a new life. And so when I got the insurance settlement, that enabled me to pick up and move. So I worked at Crow for a little over a year. And then once the insurance settlement came in, that enabled me to move to England, which was what I always wanted to do. From the time I was a little girl, I wanted to live in the UK. And so I've been here now for a little over 6 years. And what I did was I brought my old life with me, more or less, right? So I thought that I could pick up where I left off in the States. I could, make a living writing, and I could sell my artwork, and I could have shows, and I could teach to, provide a financial base and all this kind of thing. And I wasn't supposed to be doing that. Right, because that was my old life. It was a very Dionysian kind of a thing. It was like going into the abyss and coming out, like being twice born. So when you're twice born, or, when you finish at the universe, thinking about the tarot deck, you finish at the universe and then you start again as the fool. Well, when you start as the fool, you're zero. So you're not supposed to be bringing the old stuff with you. And that's what I did. And then I got a second chance at my second chance when COVID hit. Because when COVID hit, I lost the job that I had, and I owned my own flat. But because I lost my job, I didn't have the money to pay maintenance, and I was falling behind and everything, and I had to sell the flat. The people who own the lease it's a very different system here. They have things called leaseholds, which means somebody actually owns the ground that your apartment building stands on. So you have to pay them. But the people who were the leaseholders on my loft also own a complex on Matthew Street, Beatles Street, right? It's in a place called Cavern Walks. So what it is it's actually above the original site of the original Cavern Club. So they had put this like blurb in the paper that they were going to take over this shopping arcade, or what we would call a mall, and create an alternative shopping center. And so I called them and I said, hey, if I sell you my flat, will you give me the opportunity to lease one of those places and start a business there? And they said yes. And so that's how As Above, So Below Emporium was born. And the really interesting thing about how I chose the name was my shop itself sits directly over where the original stage of the cavern was.
That's amazing. Kat, you said a lot in all of that, which is great. I want to trace back to a couple of things. First of all, I'm very familiar with Tremont Tea Room. I was friends with Alex. He was an amazing guy. I interviewed him like 15 years ago on another radio show that I had. And it's just the energy from certain people that we've actually all worked with in the past is tremendous. You mentioned the Crow. So do you want to mention the whole name of the Crow where you were working?
Oh, Crowhaven Corner, right? So Crowhaven Corner, when I was a teenager, was the first witch shop that I ever visited. And that's because I grew up in a place called Lynn, which is literally, 15 minutes away from Salem. And so Laurie Cabot owned Crow at that point in time. So I was just enamored with Laurie Cabot, and I would go into the shop all the time. And then when I came back from living in Prague, Alex Palermo at the tea room called me and said, "You want to come and read for me, a couple of days a week?" And I did that. And then he turned me on to the Halloween fairs that were being run in Salem. So I would do that. And then after the accident, because I wasn't mobile and because I was hit so close to the school, I had like severe PTSD. I couldn't go near that building. So I got, somebody told me that they wanted readers at Crowhaven Corner. So I went in and talked to Lori and ended up reading there for a bit.
Yeah, so it's currently owned by Lorelei.
Yep.
And it's just the history in Salem itself, especially when we talk about these shops. It's just tremendous. I mean, Laurie Cabot was one of the spearheading witches in the 60s that actually kind of brought Salem to what it is to the current day.
And people underestimate what she did for feminism, because Laurie Cabot was instrumental in having Salem change the city logo. Because when I was a kid, the city logo was the witch on the broomstick, the silhouette of the witch on the broomstick, but she had a big hook nose with a wart on it and all this kind of thing. And Laurie Cabot went down and demanded that they change that and make it a normal silhouette. And not just because of the witchery side of it, like, casting us as old, ugly crones, but the idea that inherent in that image is a vilification of women in general. You can, for people who don't buy into, witchcraft or any of that, I mean, looking at Laurie Cabot and what she did for feminism as a whole, I think she's just an inspirational woman.
Absolutely. Even a lot of people, I've interviewed quite a few people that have been associated very closely with her. But one thing they often talk about, which a lot of people didn't realize, was that she actually was very involved in bringing kind of the discussion of witchcraft at the school level. So she went to Salem State and had, classes about learning about all of this and starting up just regular classes. I'm very good friends with the Salem cop. He actually is a retired Salem police officer, became a psychic, lives in Florida, had him on the show. And it's interesting because he tells a very cute story about how they would be having lunch on his break while he was a police officer. And Lori would come and sit with them and have lunch with them. And he said people would walk in, this luncheonette, and they'd see Salem cops at the table with Laurie Cabot, and they would be like, "What's going on here?" But she was very close with them, and like you said, made an impact, and that people really respected her and kind of what she brought to that city. And, it's very true. And you bring up feminism, which I think is so important, especially now, the empowerment of women and believing what women are able to do. But even in Salem itself, I mean, some of the leadership of Salem, I think from the mayor to, different leadership positions, in the local government have been held by women. So I think that is important too, because going back 50, 60 years ago, that probably wasn't the case,
No.
So I think a lot of that somehow could be kind of offshoots to the power of Laurie Cabot. So another thing that you said, which I find amazing, is that this second chance in life. And the correlation of the age of your father's passing, I had a very similar, not as dramatic event that happened to me. My mother, She dropped dead suddenly at 52. And when I was 52, it happened to be just after Christmas. I was having a hard time breathing. I was breathing kind of heavily. And, I just thought, oh, it's asthma. And then the VA hospital did a CAT scan on me and they were like, oh, no, well, you have to be admitted. You have a sudden pulmonary embolism. And I was like, what? And I was like, this is not happening. I want to go home. So it didn't matter how many years I was a nurse. All of your common sense like goes out the window. Your brain panics. You're like, I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to make this not happen.
Yeah.
And literally they were like, you're not going home. You're getting IV heparin and we're treating this. And, I was in the hospital for 24 hours and then I had to be on a blood thinner for 6 months. And it was a mind trip, to be honest, because I was still in the military. I was still expected to run and do all these things. And I was like, wow. I was like, the age, I started to tell people like, wow, my mom was 52 and now this just happened to me at 52, and it really could do a trip on your mind. And like you said, you're really given a second chance. And for me personally, it was my own wake-up call to say, I need to start looking at things that are in my control, because like you were in a situation that was out of your control. You couldn't put your hand up and stop that vehicle from coming towards you. I couldn't put my...
No.
Exactly. But it didn't help,
Because I literally, my brain checked out before it hit me. But when I, obviously the next day when I woke up and I saw the injuries I had, the way my left hand was completely just wrecked and my clavicle and everything. And so what I must have done was put my hand up in front of me, like, Wonder Woman, like blocking the car from coming at me,
And I find that really interesting because that's you being a human. That would be a human instinct, As much as you did put your hand out, that's something that's coming towards you that you can't control. Did you remember, and a lot of people had asked me this, because I have done in my life since I was a little child, many vivid dreams that have come true. Unfortunately, some of them were, not so good dreams. But they did come true. So a lot of people started asking me, like, did you dream of this? Did you see yourself in a hospital? Did you see the pulmonary embolism? I'm like, no, I didn't see any of that. Well, why didn't you see it if you see all these things for other people? And that's where people don't understand, how we are being gifted. We don't always see everything that people think we should. And I think that's kind of a little frustrating sometimes to people. Sometimes for myself, I'm like, I wish I saw this. I could have done something, but you don't always have that chance. So did you have any premonition in and about the time of that accident?
Well, I used to kind of think that if I was going to die early, like I always thought that I might die the same age that my father died at because I take after my father in many ways. So I used to always say that, like I believed it. And my cousin Regina and I would always take each other out for dinner for our birthdays. So the first day of classes was January 20th and my birthday is January 21st. So I was walking out the door to go and teach and my cousin said, be thinking about where you want to go for dinner tomorrow. And I turned around and I said, well, we'll see if I make it. And I was hit like a few hours later. So.
Wow.
That's
powerful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, very powerful. But I understand that. Sometimes we get these feelings about things. Being a little girl, I always would drive into this town, with my parents. And it was the neighboring town. And it was kind of like a really pretty town. And in the back of my head, I used to say, I really wish I could live here one day. But as a little girl, being 9, 10 years old, where am I living right now? The little pretty town next to the town I grew up in, So it's like, you plant these things in your mind. And in some way, I kind of feel that we manifest them,
Well, I think so. My mother used to love to tell the story about how when we lived in the Bronx, I was really small and she was doing the dishes and she had me parked in front of the TV and the news was on and they were talking about England on the news. And I I kept saying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, what's England?" And my mother said, "It's the old country. It's where America comes from. It's the old country." And I had to have been like something like 3 years old. And I turned around, I looked at her and I said, I'm going to live there someday. And my mother loved telling that story because I did end up living here.
Wow, that's cool. So you had mentioned the punk scene. I have to touch on that because in the past year, I become good friends with Monty A. Melnick, the tour manager for the Ramones, and met a lot of really cool people that are associated with the Ramones and that whole scene. So, what was your connection to the post-punk era, or your, ex's band and being in the kind of punk scene? Punk UK versus punk New York City. What was the big differences there?
Well, there's a lot of difference. So, I mean, punk, I started uh, when I went to Emerson College. And when I went to Emerson College, there were three punk rockers in the entire school. Me, and two people from New York City, Rena Shapiro and Adam Roth. And I don't know if you know who Adam Roth is, but he ended up being quite influential in New York City in the music scene. So, Adam Roth, Dennis Leary, Eddie Brill, all those guys all hung out together and they were all like at Emerson. And Adam was friends with the Ramones. So now that you bring up the Ramones, and so the Ramones are in Boston, and I had an early morning class. I don't know if I ever told you this story when we were hanging out in Salem, but so I was sitting on the Emerson wall, the famous Emerson wall, drinking a cup of coffee, waiting to go into my class. It was an 8:30 in the morning class. And I see this guy loping down Beacon Street coming toward me. And I'm looking at him like, look at this guy, like, big, tall, skinny guy with long hair and holes in his jeans. And I'm drinking my coffee and he sits down on the wall next to me. And I'm just like, I'm not even clued in that it's who it is. And I'm drinking my coffee and he looks at me and he goes, "You want to go to the Rat and have a beer?" And I had sunglasses on and I pulled my sunglasses down to the tip of my nose and I looked at him and I said, "It's 8:30 in the morning and I have a class." And then I got up and I went and I sat in my class and then dawn came over Marblehead and I'm like, holy that was Joey Ramone. And
Yes.
come to find out, like it was a secret, but like Adam, I think that they might have even been staying at Adam's apartment, or Adam had something because I told Adam that day, and he was like, "Oh yeah," he said, "I heard about that." And I think that they were staying at Adam's apartment, but yeah, I mean the the New York punk scene. From my perspective, the important people from the New York punk scene, like Patti Smith and Jim Carroll, Richard Hell, those guys, if it wasn't for music, those guys would just be like beatniks, because that's what they were. They were poets. They were writing poetry. And because they were living in the village, they could see and talk to Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs all the time and learn from them. And what they realized was, with the days of going and reading in coffee houses and all of this kind of thing, people weren't interested in poetry anymore per se. It wasn't part of the pop landscape anymore like it was in the 50s and the early 60s. It was being supplanted by rock and roll. And so subsequently, they realized that if they wanted people to hear what they had to say, they had to put it to music. And so Jim Carroll had the Jim Carroll Band, Jim Carroll and the Catholic Boys, and Patti Smith. And so they were a huge part of the New York City punk landscape. Richard Hell, the same thing with him. England was very much not, it wasn't as cerebral, although they were talking about, like, it was really horrible here at the time. There were all kinds of strikes happening and people were poor. Most of the youth were on the dole. It was really tough, and there were race riots and stuff. And so a lot of the lyrics and the rebellion was based on feeling this sort of isolation and inability to really be part of society, because here it's tiered differently. I mean, if you come from a certain place, they would look at you and say, "Well, okay, your father was a garbage man, you'll be a garbage man too," by pure dint of your class and where you come from in the city. So a lot of it was rebellion against that, but in a very working class way. It wasn't esoteric in any way. It wasn't, intellectual or poetic in any way. That stuff came with the art students later in the post-punk stuff, like Bauhaus and people like that, and Joy Division and all of that kind of thing. But the gut level, punk rock, Sex Pistols, the Damned, all this kind of stuff, the Clash. It was very basic.
Well, it's so interesting. You have so many great stories. I love them. And I love that Joey Ramone. It sounds very typical Joey, right? To just sit down and be like, hey, what's going on? Very interesting. Very cool. So I want to talk more about your experience with setting up the shop because I had followed you on social media and I know that you had to clear your space. There was a lot of like issues because you were doing it during COVID. So certain things were kind of not really happening as quickly or whatever. So do you want to give us kind of the idea of how they dedicated the spot or how you were able to clear that spot? Because most people I have not ever set up a shop, which would be a lovely dream. But there's probably a lot to do to set up a shop, to have the idea and the concept, but also to deal with, I renovated, a few places I've lived. And when you deal with contractors and all sorts of stuff, I'm sure there was a lot of issues. But then to add the UK being, they do things a different way there as well. So that would be interesting to hear your aspect on that.
Well, my experience, so here, when you go into a property, whatever you want to do to it is your responsibility. Comes out of your pocketbook and it's your responsibility. So all the shop fronts except for a cafe and a vape shop were vacant. And I was looking at all of them. And because, like I mentioned before, this particular shop sat directly over the cavern stage, I said, I want this one. So I knew what I wanted it to look like. And I was lucky enough to have a bunch of mates from the pub, boys that were, working in contracting and things like that, or people came in and volunteered to paint. And one guy who, does electrics and different things came in and did my lighting and all of that. And I chose all my shop fittings from charity shops and antique shops. I don't have any traditional like countertops or anything like that. I have a makeshift soap holder, which is an old wash basin from a cruise ship. My till station, or where I keep my cash register, that's an old reservations desk from a 19th century hotel. I made a public altar out of an old, I think it's from Morocco originally, but it's where people would keep the tackle for like their saddles and reins and, horse gear. I made that a public altar. The challenge I had in the shop was that it was haunted, severely haunted. And still have spirit activity in there, but not like I had when I started. When I started, this one guy was playing around with the electricity. So my lights would flash on and off, my register would go off, my credit card machine would go off. And I found it really disturbing that the lights would flash on and off really fast when anybody came in with children. And the energy that I picked up was not of a child or a poltergeist type energy. It was a man. So I just didn't like this energy at all. And I had to do a number of big rituals to get rid of them. And I finally did get rid of them. Now the story goes, so the street that the Cavern Club, where the Beatles played so many gigs, is famous for that. The name of the street is Matthew Street. The original name of the street was Pluckington Alley. It is named after a guy named Matthew Pluckington. And Matthew Pluckington was a very rich merchant in the 1700s, but it was rumored that his success came from Satanism. And when they were doing work underground, they found all these peculiar rooms underground, way underground, under Matthew Street. Some of them had altars. There were symbols carved into like makeshift stone dining room tables. So they believe that there was like a lot of rituals and stuff like that that were being performed underneath Matthew Street. So Matthew Street is heavily haunted. The Cavern Club itself is haunted. Cavern Walks Arcade is haunted. My shop has two energies. There's a cigarette smoking guy who hangs out in my back storage room. And there's a woman in black who hovers around the public altar from time to time. So that was the thing that I had to deal with, was that kind of energy.
So, how long did it take for you to clear out that or identify? Because sometimes in the beginning, I've been brought into a lot of paranormal investigations, and you're in there for 5 hours, or you're in there for an overnight or whatever. Sometimes it takes a while to determine who the spirit is. So, for the fact that you were in that space day in, day out, how long did it take to really identify?
Well, I couldn't tell you like who the guy was or what his history was. I just knew it was male and I knew it was malevolent. There was one time before the shop opened when I was in there setting up. So I was doing a number of things between like, moving furniture around to like unpacking boxes, like the first of my stock and things like that. And I was frustrated about something. I don't remember what it was. And I was like really thinking, I was being pretty negative, like, oh, what the like, blah, 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 excuse me, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, really loud, like it was a clear auditory. It wasn't like in my head that I intuited it. I just heard someone say like that. And I was like, oh, no, 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 no. This is not happening. And I had to have a long talk. And I was like, look, this is my space. If you don't like it, you can go. Or I will gladly share the space with you if you're going to help me and be my guardian. But if you're going to be aggressive to me and you're going to be abusive to me, then you're going to have to go. And if you won't go by my asking you to go, then I'm going to get you out of here and you won't like it. And subsequently, that's how it happened. I had to do a big ritual cleansing and get him out, and it took about two or three goes.
So I find this interesting. I've never been there, and I really want to go there because it's so iconic, this area. But you talk about your space being above the cavern. So do you think that the spirits came from the cavern, or you think the spirits are coming
The
from the
spirit
neighborhood?
I think the spirit is attached to that whole energy of Matthew Pluckington and whatever was going on underneath, right? As a matter of fact, this man, here's another interesting story for you, Kath. So this very interesting looking old man came into this shop and he's very Edwardian, like steampunky looking. And he was an elderly gentleman and he just had this presence about him. And he just walked in and he was looking around and he said, well, young lady, young lady, right? And he says, well, young lady, he says, you really have done something wonderful here. And started talking to me about, his interests in the occult and what have you. And it turns out that this guy is a member of the Golden Dawn. Now, ironically, the Golden Dawn, started in the UK, but it no longer has like a real official temple, like meeting place. The big official one is in Berlin. And so this man knew David Bowie because Bowie was a member of the same place. And so he used to go and do the meetings and rituals and all that stuff together. He told me the story. He's the one that told me about Matthew Pluckington, and he's the one that told me about the suspicions of what was going on underneath. And he told me that in response to when I was telling him about because he asked me, one of the first things he asked me was there anything unusual happening in the shop? And, even still to this day, there were weird, like little shenanigans, things get moved around or something like that, or, rearranged or lost and then found. But that's, par for the course. And that doesn't bother me because that's not aggressive energy. That's just sort of like hi, people saying hi and letting you know that they're there, or maybe making suggestions that you could put something here and it would look better, something like that. But this was aggressive and it was dark. And I think that this man like came into the shop to kind of like give me the heads up in a way. But he was a very interesting character. And like I said, that's how I found out about Matthew Pluckington. And that's how I kind of zoned in on how dark that energy really was.
Just for the sake of the audience, can you explain the Golden Dawn? Some people may not be familiar with that.
The Golden Dawn is an esoteric order. It's a magic, magicians. It's not like a witch's coven. It's a very different kind of thing, and it's levels of practice and levels of achievement that take you to the highest. You're given like little titles and take you to the highest level. And Aleister Crowley was booted out of the Golden Dawn. There's a story about that too, but I won't bore you with that one.
No, I think you should say that because Aleister Crowley is is on a lot of people's minds when they start getting involved in talking about expanding their mind and looking at different methods to do things. So Aleister Crowley is actually.
Well, I don't like Crowley. I carry his books in my shop, and some of his books in my shop, and I read the Thoth deck. That's my deck. That's what I read from. Now I don't like him, but before he went crazy and got swallowed up by his own ego, he came up with a lot of really valuable stuff. And just like anything else in the world, you have to separate the wheat from the chaff. You can't just look at somebody and totally discount them. And if you decide that you don't like something, you have to know why you don't like it. Right. So you have to read it to know why you don't like it. You don't just look at it and go like, well, I don't like that. I mean, I think that's the problem with the world today. Everybody's got an opinion on something, but they don't know why they think what they think. They just think it because they heard it somewhere else, and that's that. But I'll tell you, my Crowley
I totally believe that. I agree with you 100%. Especially people that form an opinion, but then you question them on it, and they have no idea what they're talking about.
Exactly. So when I was living in London back in the early 80s, and I decided I was going to get married, and I had a group of mates in Boston, and I told them that I was getting married, and they were all guys, and they decided they had to come and check this guy out. They weren't going to let me get married until they saw this guy and checked him out. So they were part of a band called James Strait and the Bureaucrats. And it was the guitarist and the drummer of that band that came out, and their friend Dominic. So Gregory, whose stage name was Bob Belvedere, but Gregory, his name was Gregory Fulcino, and he sadly passed away a couple of years ago. He was the guitarist, and although he didn't play in the style of Jimmy Page was like one of his heroes. And of course, Jimmy Page was a Crowley, fanatic, and he even owned Crowley's ceremonial robes and slept in them and all this kind of thing. And I'm not going to go into my opinion on that, but be too many expletives there. But Gregory wanted to see the Crowley archives. Now, just like you were saying, back in the 80s, we didn't, there were things that people didn't talk about. And ironically, you would think that here in the UK, things of like the occult nature and such would be talked about freely. So I didn't know where to find the Crowley archives. I had no idea. So back in the day, we had no computers, we had no Google. We couldn't like run around and like tap in and get information. So what you did was you called information on the phone, right? So I call information and I'm saying, I'm looking for this. And people are hanging up on me. They're hanging up. They're not even saying, well, this. Finally, somebody talks to me and they say, there's a place on the Strand. This is in London. There's a place on the Strand and it's called, I'm sorry, it'll come to me, but there was a place on the Strand to go. And when I got there, I thought it was a prestidigitation club. I thought it was like a magician's, amateur magician's club or something like that. So the Magic Circle, it was called the Magic Circle. So I went and I jumped up and down, like trying to look. It looked like it was all shut. And I was jumping up and down, trying to look in the windows. And the story was that I was to say that I was a student doing research and I was doing a study on comparative religion, and I wanted to use like Aleister Crowley stuff. So I was looking for the archives and I was sent there. this little old man walks out and he looks at us and he says, "Can I help you?" And so I give him the story and he knows I'm lying, right? He looks at me and he's just giving me this look like, "Yeah, no, don't lie to me." And he says, "Look, he first of all, he says to me, he was a very bad man. And we threw he used to belong to us. So where I was actually something to do with the Golden Dawn, right?" And he's telling me, "Oh, we threw him out of our order. He's a very bad man." And then he says, "Would you like to come inside and see what's inside?" And I said, "Yes." And so all the boys started to follow me, and he turned around and he looked at all of them and he said, "Not you, just her." So I go in and I'm walking along the hallway, and there are all these photographs, and these photographs are going back to daguerreotypes. And there are all these men, and they're all like in hooded robes, holding swords and standing in circles. And I'm like, holy crap, because I'm recognizing people in these photographs, like members of the royal family and such. And then he had this hologram. It was like a frame, black glass on the wall, and inside the black glass looked like a three-dimensional ball. And he said, "Look at the ball and concentrate on it and tell it what you want it to do. Don't speak, just think it, say what you want it to do, and it will do it, or see if you can make it do it." And I said, "Okay." So I looked at the ball and I said, "Turn red," and it turned red. And then I thought at it, move, bounce up and down, and it bounced up and down. And then I thought about it, like turn yellow and go left to right, and it did. It was crazy stuff. Then he took me into the inner room, and inside the inner room, they had a circle, pentacle, and surround on all different sigils around the pentacle, and it lit up from the inside. And he told me, he was like, I was one of the only women that had up to that point had ever been inside that room. And then when he was walking me out, he said, "You'll be back when you're older." And I've always found that really interesting, because it's like, I don't think that he was referring to that structure. I think that he was referring to the dedication to the craft and to metaphysics and esotericism, like, because I did come back later when I was older and here in England. So that to me is a pretty interesting story.
That's amazing. When the minute you said you'll be back when you're older, I thought of you relocating, and making that your home. And that's really fascinating. So, how did these mates of yours, did they approve of your
Yeah,
husband to be at the time?
they were off that they could not go in. They did not like that idea at all, that only I could go in there. But Gregory met somebody who, had known of Alistair or had been connected to Crowley, so he was, satisfied.
Yeah, I find these stories really fascinating because a lot of people, a lot of people know a lot of things, but you can't know everything, and that's why I really enjoy speaking to people that have actually been there. When you could say, I've been there and done that, I really saw the room, I really saw, so that image that you were looking at, it was almost like it was reading your thoughts. Do you think it was a mind reader machine? How do you figure that?
Called it a hologram, but I don't know. The way I kind of thought about it was that it was something that they had rigged it up so that if you had the ability, like if your psychic ability was strong, then you would be able to get that instrument to work. That the only thing I could.
Yeah, well, that's really curious, though. I wonder if the people that joined the Golden Dawn, if they took people that they found were more in tune psychically, or, were more gifted than others. Did you ever find out the details to the Golden Dawn?
I think that, sometimes that opens up your interest in it. As far as people that I know nowadays, a lot of them go to it from being exposed, because it's a similar a concept to like being a Mason, isn't it? So I think a lot of them move over to it from Masonry. I think that people are looking for a way to gain or harness power I don't think necessarily, it's like that old saying, like, you don't have to be psychic to be a witch, and you don't have to be a witch to be a psychic, right? Well, I don't think that you have to be psychic to be a magician, right? I know some people who were trying to be in the OTO here, and like, I don't think that they were necessarily skilled at the site, having the site. So, it's like anything else. People gravitate towards something. Some people will gravitate toward it for all kinds of altruistic reasons and for enlightenment and for the purpose for which it was created, to elevate your spirit, and to get you to that place where you are closest to touching God. I mean, that's a theme that runs through Kerouac. That's like what his entire journey is about. It's about one man's or two or a group of people's efforts to live a life that enables them to elevate their spirits and to touch God. And I think that in our own way, whether we're musicians, playing rock and roll music, punk rock music, whatever we're doing, jazz, whatever it is, we're elevating our spirit. And when we elevate our spirit and we free ourselves, we come closer to touching and understanding God. And I think that it's the same thing when we seek information through these different organizations, or these different, methods of learning or exploring. Some people have that altruistic idea that that's what they want to do, and that's why they want to do it. And other people, like Crowley, it's like, I want power, and we know what power corrupts. You're living in the middle of it right now over there.
Absolutely. Very cool. So tell us, just as we wrap this up, and I mean, I could talk to you for a whole nother show. I want to be able to just have you plug your website, your the services that you provide, if you have anything that can be purchased, if someone's living overseas, if you do any readings online, just plug your shop.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yes. So my website is www.asabovemporium.com. I do have a web shop. You can book readings with me. I do them over Zoom as well as in person in the shop. My web shop is being overhauled at the moment, but you can I design altar supplies like wands and athames. I have an Egyptian line with a mirror of Hathor, and I'm going to have a sistra. In that Egyptian line, I have an ancient Greek line with a wand of Apollo and wand of Dionysus, and I'm going to design very soon a wand of Hermes. So you can buy these things on the web shop. I also do spell kits. So I have like Aphrodite spell kits and Hecate spell kits and Apollo spell kits, which consist of soap and incense and oils and all these things that I make and put together, and candles, which I make also and put together in deluxe or mini spell kits. And, talk about plugging. I am going to be launching a GoFundMe in a couple of months. Now that I've set my footprint in the brick and mortar thing, it's not the alternative market that I was promised it was going to be. So I have to rely more on bringing people into my shop through a social media presence, and also to strengthen my online website, my online shop, that I think that the shop is going to be boosted and will do better.
Wow. Well, very cool. There's a lot to happen in this year. I've been telling a lot of people about 2025 and numerology. That's the year of the 9. So a lot of things that we have planned for this year will be completed. And I look forward to maybe possibly visiting you this coming year, or seeing your shop in person, which would be super great.
I hope so. I want you to come, and I want you to do an author's talk and book signing, and even be a guest reader in the shop. I think that would just be so cool.
Very awesome. So thank you again, Kat. Your shop is As Above, So Below, and that is in Liverpool, England. And we're going to roll out with the song She's in Parties by Bauhaus. A pleasure to have you on again.
Thanks, Kathy. It was lovely to see you.
Thank you.
special effects by lunatic and